Y2K was 20 years ago. What are your best Y2K stories? I'm going to kick this off by sharing my own. I used to work for a small business that was owned by two evangelical Christians. They were quite pushy with their beliefs. And one of those beliefs was that the 1st of January 2000 was the day of the rapture, daily. I would have to endure them loudly talking to each other about how everyone needs to be ready. Everyone. Then they would ask me what my plans were. I would do my best not to engage. I noticed they stopped making the schedule past New Year's Eve. The schedule was simply blank. When I asked why, they told me it was because they wouldn't be there. They would be with Jesus. And I still had time to be saved. To be clear, I never stated what my faith was when I worked for the Messiah. My mother always said that you never talk about politics, religion, money, or anyone's weight in polite company. I just knew that no matter what my answer was, it would be wrong. They just knew I didn't attend their church, which to them was the only valid church. Therefore, I was going to hell. It was a Southern Baptist church. In case you were curious, January 2nd was interesting. I had to call the shop to ask if I was supposed to work that day. The bosses were in a shitty mood. One was frantically setting the schedule for the month and the other was ordering business supplies. Yeah, we were out of a lot of our regular stuff because they felt there was no need to restock. I wanted so badly to ask why they weren't taken in the rapture. I had endured months of belligerence from over this topic. I always politely sidestepped the question, just saying that as far as I knew, mankind cannot predict or declare the day of the rapture. One of them was hateful about it and the other was increasingly worried I would be left behind for all the bad stuff that would follow. I felt kind of bad for them in a way. They had been preparing for this for months. I wouldn't have been surprised if they gave things away. But I didn't dare ask. I ended up leaving that job by the end of the month for unrelated reasons. It was a really bad place to work all around and I've never gone back since. I was 8 during the Y2K craze. Growing up in a small town, about 5,000 people, on the east coast of the USA where most of the people were very religious and scared of technology. At that time only a few households in my neighborhood had a computer but only 1 or 2 had the internet. My parents and I spent night at our next-door neighbor's house. They had the internet and were avid hunters who had gone through the hassle of getting extra food and supplies just in case. My neighbors had 2 teenage boys. We were gathered in their basement to watch the ball drop on TV. And right at the stroke of midnight one of the teenage boys snuck over to the circuit breaker and cut the power for the house. The next minute or so was just sheer panic from the adults. I just sat there not fully understanding what was going on. Of course they had flashlights on hand. And the teenager who cut the power was quickly found sitting underneath the circuit breaker, giggling like a little girl. The giggles quickly turned to fear as his parents started shrieking at him and giving him a whopping. In my special Y2K closet I still have 1. 2 MREs. I ate 1 and it was terrible. 2. Paper towels 3. Toilet paper 4. Paper plates 5. Plasticware 6. Several cans of Sterno 7. And a hand crank powered AM radio. FYI, 1 million cranks yields about 2 minutes of radio. I've been told that my brothers and I came down with chicken pox. So my parents were stuck at home for Y2K. Better luck next millennium, I guess. Lived in a house in the middle of the boonies with my friends shortly after high school. This house was owned by a survivalist software engineer who said we could live there rent-free on the condition that we all go through survivalist training by a high-ranking Marine officer at his own expense. This was him initiating a small group of go-getters who would help him recreate society after the apocalypse, which was inevitably coming, most likely with a Y2K societal collapse. I learned how to navigate and triangulate with and without map and compass, lead a group of civilian soldiers, and shoot a Colt 45. By the end of training, I could assemble and disassemble it in a minute and 7 seconds blindfolded. The peak of our training was when my best friend and I, both female, took down a line of cans at 30 yards from the outside in, one starting on the left and the other starting on the right, in complete tandem, hitting the middle one simultaneously. The man who trained us was gushing with pride that day. New Year's came around. We sat by the fire, took some acid and contemplated what was next for our lives. In October, my dad finished off the Spam he purchased for Y2K. He bought 12 cases of it because it was super cheap leading up to Y2K and he just really enjoys Spam. Monsieur, I am honestly impressed at the dedication of someone to eat 288 cans of Spam over 20 years. I was the liaison between sales and production for a company that made automatic transfer switches. In October 1999, it was my job to make sure production was shipping them out on time. They wouldn't give me a computer, so I had to keep track of everything on paper and fax. I quit in November of 1999. Neighborhood kid hit some kind of transformer with a mortar shell, knocked out the power on our block and a few others about 15 minutes after midnight. I was 12 and thought it was funny. I guess I never truly believed society could crumble from some ones and zeros. However, a Y2K of guests who were my parents started wailing like Armageddon had just began. It was funny. Not really a good story. Or a story, really. But I used to read the hip-hop magazine, The Source, and I remember they had an issue on Y2G, as they called it, Year 2 Grand. I guess it was pretty cringy. It had Jay-Z in some weird, metallic, futuristic clothing and some backup dancers with spiky hair on the cover. I lived overseas and was watching the news with family and friends on the Armed Forces Network. The newscast did the countdown and then they cut the feed and it went to static. There were several gasps and then about 5 seconds later the feed came back and the newscast shouted, "Just kidding. Happy New Year." I thought it was pretty clever. At the time, my parents loved X-Files and Millennium because they were all the rage at the time. X-Files gave me a legit phobia of aliens to the point of sleepless nights. That went on until freshman year of high school in 2003. Anyway, I was still religious and in Catholic school at the time and was very scared about the end of the world. But specifically because of that Millennium show, even though it ended I think the year prior to 2000. I literally asked my parents to take me to confession because I was so scared. Now, X-Files is my favorite show ever and Millennium is criminally underrated. I got up at 3 a.m. to check if the world had ended. It had not, so I went back to bed. My favorite thing was cemetery headstones that were not Y2K compliant. People had headstones made before they died with the 19 pre-engraved, planning on filling in the next 2 digits when the time came. Oops. They kept living. I worked in IT at one of the Dow Industrial Company's headquarters, and I spent a high percentage of 1999 doing Y2K tests on every single computer, server, printer, fax machine and, I'm pretty sure, coffee maker. No problems. And no signs of problems that year was a waste of my life. My dad had been paid quite a bit over the previous year, as he was a COBOL programmer 20 to 30 years before, and it was mostly COBOL programs that people worried about. The panic helped increase his wage. A lot of stuff did end up getting fixed, which is why things didn't go as badly as predicted. He didn't work at all this century. Part of it was that he had made enough that he could stop working. But I think a large part was that he developed an inflated sense of what his skills were worth over those few years, and has never been offered anything close since. New Year's Eve itself, I had a very bad cold. I spent most of the night huddled in my bed. At midnight I went across the street for half an hour. Some friends had gotten the key to the roof of the engineering building, the Warburg building, and we went up there to watch the fireworks. My dad was a systems analyst, working for what was then a major UK high street retailer based in Liverpool, who had their own in-house EPOS system that my dad worked on. His department learned of the Y2K issue at a conference in 94 or 95, and had the system 90% compliant by 1998, but the management were very cautious. Everything was tested and retested, and Dad was on call throughout December 99. With incredibly generous rates. The office was at the Albert Dock, and Dad was called in New Year's Eve as a precaution. So we got to watch the fireworks over the Mersey from the top floor where Dad's office was. Dad reckons the extra pay, after tax, amounted to about 6 weeks' pay. I went to watch the fireworks in London. Climbed a tree to watch and didn't get arrested. I didn't see any trouble all night. Best behaved crowd ever. Had to walk home cause all the tube stations were closed. I worked for a county that had several landfill sites with no hydro or water, including mine. I didn't really believe Y2K was going to happen, but if it did, I was secure knowing that I could move my kids and I to the attendance shack that I worked out of. It was heated with propane and had propane lanterns. Next to it was a large empty storage shed where I figured I could move my rats. I ran a rat rescue at the time and had about 40 of them. Monsieur, no one gets left behind. I had lots of camping supplies on hand, including a portable propane heater for my rats in the storage shed, and I had filled several 5-gallon bottles of water, just in case. I've always been a bit of a survivalist, so I had, and have, enough food for 4 people to last about 3 months. I figured we had more than enough to stay warm and fed for the few days it would take to get things got back on track. Alternatively, I also had the keys for a small Buddhist cabin in a fairly remote spot. The owner only goes there maybe once a year and only in summer. It also is heated with propane and is waterfront. This is also my getaway in case I'm ever hiding from the law. I was night shift for IT. Watched the one system we deliberately hadn't patched as it was being phased out. Waited to see it crash. We knew it wasn't compliant. Nothing. Fuck all. It finally failed in February. We never bothered to look at what happened, that I know of. I was 10 years old and spent the night at my grandparents' house. My grandparents had stockpiled food just in case, but weren't tripping much beyond that. Once it hit midnight, I watched as nothing happened to my digital watch. Then we looked outside, saw our normal fireworks, and on TV everyone at the ball drop was like, okay, cool. So we good. I was in 8th grade. And I remember my friend's mom was dating someone who fully believed civilization would stop. We went with her to the grocery store to buy $500 worth of canned food, and helped her stack the cans next to his drums of water in the basement. When nothing happened at New Year's, I laughed thinking about all the canned corn they would have to eat with dinner for the next year. We were in high school. Had a huge group of friends, 30 plus, that spent New Year's at my friend's parents' house. We were doing the countdown. Everyone was nervous from all the hype that computers were not going to be able to calculate the date correctly and revert to 1900. Shutting down vital city systems. Internet and computers were just beginning to take over managing everything. For reference, I had a beeper in high school, guys. 5.4.3.2.1. The entire house goes completely dark. Silence. Dad comes upstairs, looks at our scared faces and starts his ass off, slapping his legs and doubling over with humor. Can't catch his breath. He flipped the breaker. Lights back, come on. Happy Y2K everyone. It was perfect. I drank 2 bottles of red wine. Got a nosebleed. I was working one fiberglass at the time and I used to get them a lot. And was sat on the doorstep vomiting when midnight struck. I was working as a 911 operator in Canada. Its staff and the mayor were all wringing their hands about midnight. At the stroke of midnight, numerous panicky calls about an apartment building on fire came in. I tried to dispatch that town's fire trucks and came up totally empty. It was a blank screen. So we did it the old-fashioned way and made phone calls. Turns out the glitch was unrelated to Y2K but was a human error. I am from the rural Midwest. Looking back at my childhood, you would think I grew up in the 1970s and not the 90s because of how country my hometown was. My family didn't really understand Y2K, but they bought into the hype. A lot of religious people were twisting the whole thing into an apocalyptic type of thing. I was a kid and it scared me. I dreaded New Year's Eve, because I was worried that was when the world would end. A few days prior, a low-flying aircraft of some kind flew over the family farm. It was so loud and must have been going fast because there was a sound that may have been a sonic boom. I was outside with my grandpa and I ran inside at the sound, hid under the kitchen table and started bawling. My grandpa fished me out from the table and I told him why I was so scared. He and I rang in the New Year's together to that year so he could show me that everything would be fine. A law firm co-worker was obsessed with it. She was a Jesus freak who was convinced it was the end of the world. Starting about 2 years before, she started selling off all her shit and bought herself a corner of a property somewhere in Idaho. She bought a hand-crank clothes washer, wood stove, and had a cabin built. She bought books like When There Is No Doctor and When There Is No Dentist and other survivalist books. She also bought guns and rifles and took shooting lessons. We found out when she left an email to a friend on the common printer where she discussed having gone to the range that weekend and shooting like 3,000 rounds. Because she was a Jesus freak, she also thought Y2K was gonna be the start of Armageddon. So it was easy to imagine her standing on the porch of her shotgun shack blowing away the neighbors, all the while singing, "Jesus Loves Me." She quit about 3 months before and moved into her cabin. Nobody ever heard from her after that. The husband of a co-worker in that same firm was also just like that, except for the Jesus Christ part. He stockpiled weapons. Also was a security guard who months after Y2K was nabbed by the feds for gun trafficking. But that's another story. Starting at about 8 p.m. on night, he got on the internet to track the world ending as midnight crept across the world, and was in chat rooms with his fellow survivalists all the while. So at about 12:03 local time, his wife quietly unplugged his modem long enough for him to flip the fuck out, then quietly plugged it in. Spent the holidays with my Oma and Opa up north. Woke up January 1, 2000 with the house shaking. And for a split second my 9-year-old mind thought everyone who had been freaking out about the new millennium were right. Ended up just being the Kapawa earthquake. I was 10 at the time. I cried a little and hugged my family's microwave goodbye. Lost my virginity on 31 Deck 99. That was 20 years ago! Exclamation mark. Alberta, Canada. My dad worked for the provincial government and was assigned to Alberta Environment's Y2K Rapid Response Team. Monsieur, if the millennium bug caused anything in the oil fields to go boom, Dad would have to supervise cleanup efforts. January 1, 2000. At around 1:30 a.m. Dad got the call. Yeah, everything's fine. Rapid Response Team is being disbanded. Go back to bed and enjoy your day off. I'm a firefighter and was working on the Y2K night. Right at midnight, all of our primary radio and CAD systems failed. It was a huge, system-wide failure just like everybody predicted would happen. We were getting dispatched by backup radios and our dispatchers were writing down calls on pieces of paper. The suckers that my engine company had the first call of the year. But we didn't get credit for it because of the confusion. When they put calls into the computer after it was fixed, we ended up with call 00013. Fuck you engine 3. We were first sincerely, E12. I was managing the IT department in a state agency, and were under enormous pressure to prevent any Y2K problems on NY Day. I went to work before dawn, and tested everything before the exec director arrived. Relieved that everything was working okay, we went to IHOP for a celebratory breakfast. The IHOP bill was date-timed, stamped 32 Dec 1999. My mother was one of those folks that was convinced that everything was going to implode for Y2K. She thought that it would be like a post-apocalyptic nightmare. No food at the stores, banks shut down, people rioting, the whole 9 yards. She desperately tried to convince me, my 2 brothers, and all of our families to come to her place in the country and bunker down for the duration. Of course, none of us were going for that, but we did keep in touch so that she didn't worry too much. I will never forget the phone call where she explained that she had stockpiled canned goods, bought a generator, and bought a milk cow. The cow was so that the kids would have milk since there obviously wouldn't be any at the store. After all, commerce broke down. Monsieur, her heart was in the right place, but really, Mom, a milk cow. None of the kids were even babies that would need milk. She ended up selling the cow shortly after. Nothing happened. We still laugh about the Y2K milk cow.